with Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, September 26th, 2024. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Jeff Schuhrke, author of Blue Collar Empire, the Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anticommunist Crusade. And later in the show, Seamus Malekafzali joins us to talk about Israel's assault in Lebanon. Also on the program today, New York City Mayor Eric Adams has been indicted on federal bribery and corruption charges, the first for a sitting mayor of this city.
Or is he going deep cover to fight crime?
Ooh. Twist. Well, Andrew Cuomo sees an opportunity. He ogles it, in fact. He wants to grope the mayor's office with both hands. Netanyahu speaking at the UN today as Israel continues striking Lebanon and Beirut suburbs, trying to escalate, calling up IDF reservists for a potential ground invasion. Rashida Tlaib calls on Antony Blinken to resign after ProPublica reveals his office buried U.S. agency assessments that Israel was blocking food and aid. Bernie Sanders introduces legislation to block arms sales to Israel. Israel dumps 88 unidentifiable bodies in Gaza. Oh, yeah, that was the number. I didn't even put that together.
I don't know. Maybe coincidence, probably.
Anyway, Democrats start spending big in Florida and Texas Senate races. Representative Clay Higgins, who once voted for David Duke for Louisiana governor, is under fire for calling Haitian migrants thugs and slapstick gangsters in a tweet he then deleted. Biden to issue an executive order targeting machine gun conversion devices for 3D printed guns. Kamala Harris cozies up to crypto, marking a very disheartening break from Biden's posture. Lena Khan's FTC cracks down on AI, taking action against 5 companies that used AI to mislead consumers, writing fake reviews, among other things. Some more Mark Robinson insanity. In 2009, he mused online about how cops should have shot Al Sharpton. And lastly, Hurricane Helene is about to hit Florida, strengthening over the Gulf of Mexico's record hot waters. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's an EmMajority Report Thursday. Hello, hello, hello. Liza Minnelli outlives, which is a great Twitter account, writes in, Liza Minnelli outlives Eric Adams' political career. That's the end of that. Yes, we'll get into that in just a second. Actually, maybe we'll just start right off the rip with Eric Adams, because this is a big story. I mean, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, indicted on federal charges.
Also a political enemy.
Yes, and, well, I mean, we were told by Bret Stephens and other very intelligent people in the New York Times that he was the future of the Democratic Party.
Nate Silver.
Yes, because there was this false notion that Black Lives Matter or defund the police was more than some activist slogan, that it actually had a toehold in the Democratic Party, which it didn't. I mean, outside of a few squad members and some progressive members in blue states and state houses across the country, defund the police was never incorporated into the Democratic Party's platform.
It was briefly accepted for campaign reasons, and it helped Democrats in 2020.
It did. And then Biden went on the State of the Union and screamed, I want to fund the police more. So,
and the status quo people got their wish, and we're all living in it.
But like there was this fiction that there needed to be a new kind of Democrat that would embrace funding the police, and Eric Adams was representative
as if that was
this.
Be new, but yeah,
right. It was ridiculous. And so, but he's acting like a true crooked cop here. He has now been charged with acting as an unregistered foreign agent, for taking actions in his official capacity as mayor, receiving donations from foreign sources. It's basically that he took bribes, allegedly, and illegal campaign contributions related to his mayoral campaign in exchange for doing some good, some favors for the government of Turkey. Let's go to the indictment here. This is the part where you get the quid pro quo, because his connections to the Turkish government had been established for a few years and had been growing in its weirdness. But the question was like, what was Turkey getting in exchange for their patronage of Eric Adams? And the indictment says this. In September 2021, the Turkish official told Eric Adams, the defendant, that it was his turn to repay the Turkish official by pressuring the New York City Fire Department to facilitate the opening of a new Turkish consular building, a 36-story skyscraper without a fire inspection, in time for a high-profile visit by Turkey's president. At the time, the building would have failed an FDNY inspection. In exchange for free travel and other travel-related bribes in 2021 and 2022 arranged by Turkish officials, Adams did as instructed. Because of Adams' pressure on the FDNY official responsible for the FDNY's assessment of the skyscraper fire safety was told that he would lose his job if he failed to acquiesce. And after Adams intervened, the skyscraper opened as requested by the Turkish official. Now, this is an image of the skyscraper here. Very glitzy. I mean, is that the Chrysler building in the background?
It is. I've seen this building.
This is prime
times.
real estate in Midtown Manhattan.
I think it's close to the UN.
Law and order, skipping over fire codes to pay back the guys that paid for your tickets to all over the world. Let's pull up this part of the indictment here. This is what was alleged. No, the other part. We'll read that in a second. The part about his flights.
While he's finding this, I just want to just point out, like, this idea that these buildings go up. There's another building that's sort of like a leaning tower of like West Manhattan or whatever.
Right.
We should be able to be proud of this skyline and not look at it as evidence of corruption written into the goddamn heavens. Be nice. But anyway, yeah, we found this piece here.
This is in reference to the flight. So the central claim is that basically he received in campaign contributions and then over $124,000 in flight and travel benefits. This is an excerpt on the flight benefits. Because the Turkish airline provided free travel benefits worth tens of thousands of dollars to Eric Adams, the defendant, he flew the Turkish airline even when doing so was otherwise inconvenient. For example, during the July and August 2017 trip, Adams' partner was surprised to learn that Adams was in Turkey when she had understood him to be flying from New York to France. Adams responded in a text message, transferring here, first stop is always Istanbul. Oh yeah, that's what people say.
It's the world crossroads.
When Adams' it's like, everyone is called, how Eric Adams says that New York City, there's that supercut of New York City, X city is the New York City of X country. Yeah, right. Istanbul is the Atlanta of the world, where everyone's flights transfer,
it's
apparently.
Just a constant aerial thoroughfare.
Many people are saying this. When Adams' partner later inquired about planning a trip to Easter Island, Chile, Adams responded, or repeatedly asked her whether the Turkish airline could be used for their flights, requiring her to call the Turkish airline to confirm that they did not have routes between New York and Chile. So he's desperately trying to get this Turkish airline to fly him all over the world for free.
I don't want to get bogged down in geography. Turkish Airlines, I'll just say it doesn't surprise me necessarily that Turkish Airlines would have like direct flights between, like, say, Istanbul and New York, but not that and Easter Island, Chile.
Yeah. Yeah. Just off the top of your head, that does make sense. This other part of the indictment was quite amusing. So the FBI is starting to pick up on this. They seized his devices last year. Apparently separated Adams from his mayoral security detail to do so. So they've known this is really serious for around a year. On November 6, 2023, FBI agents executed a search warrant for the electronic devices used by Eric Adams, the defendant. Although Adams was carrying several electronic devices, including 2 cell phones, he was not carrying his personal cell phone, which is the device he used to communicate about the conduct described in the indictment. When Adams produced his personal cell phone the next day in response to a subpoena, it was locked, such that the device required a password to open. Adams claimed that after he learned about the investigation into his conduct, he changed the password on November 5th, 2023, there's a typo here, and increased the complexity of his password from 4 digits to 6. Adams had done this, he claimed, to prevent members of his staff from inadvertently or intentionally deleting the contents of his phone because, according to Adams, he wished to preserve the contents of his phone due to the investigation. But Adams further clarified he had forgotten the password he had just set and thus was unable to provide the FBI with a password that would unlock the phone. You know, the thing about Eric Adams is he's actually extremely dumb. Dude, got people that steal your phone on the street.
Yeah.
Can find a way to jailbreak your phone with the password. You think the FBI is not going to be able to get in once you change the passcode from 4 digits to 6?
It is not exactly exculpatory to say my staff, after hearing this, would be take it upon themselves to go into their phone and start destroying evidence. What kind of office are you running if that's the sort of impulse that they're going to draw, even assuming you're innocent, which, I mean, I don't know, is something I make.
Right. It's so shoddy. He had scandals before he became mayor in terms of, like, where do you actually live, buddy? You're saying that you live in this area of Brooklyn, but you are clearly living in New Jersey. Sketchy tax claims related to his residence. But let's hear him out. Today he responded, was out in an outdoor press conference in New York City as a very unpopular politician responding to these charges. And let's see how this goes for him.
This is not a black day. This is not a black day. This is a youth day. This is a youth day, Eric Adams. This is not a black day. Your policies are anti-black. You are a disgrace to all black people in this city. The things that you have done are unconscionable.
Maybe the outdoor press conference was a bad mistake.
Maybe.
Our children are harassed by the police. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. You can shush me all you want, but the people are with us. And this is not a black day. This is a justice day.
First of all, I want to thank you for being here this morning. And I want to thank the supporters of all ethnic groups.
He's so weird.
Especially the Turkish.
Okay. It is rare to have a politician be this weird and also be, like, his political career to end in such a humorous way. Like, this dude, he's often compared to Trump, and I guess it's a little reductive. They're both from New York, and they're both pro-cop. They're both kind of idiots that say bizarre things all the time.
Slimy charisma.
Yeah, but he does have that quality of, like, he is going to say whatever he needs to say in every single interaction to win the interaction, and what he says in one conversation is not really connected to what he says in the next conversation. Like, he ran both as a reformer because when he was a cop, there was a period where he was criticizing some of the racism of the NYPD, but then he was also running as an anti-Black Lives Matter, anti-defund the police guy, was trying to reverse some of the reforms that Mayor de Blasio tried to put into place to little effect. And, de Blasio, in hindsight, he was thwarted in some ways. He wasn't as strong as we wish, but the NYPD was doxing his daughter, for example.
Be quite strong, and hopefully we get one of those mayors sometime soon.
Right. Adams ran in the exact opposite direction. He basically just appeared as all things to all people. I'm both a reformer and I'm also going to be extremely pro-cop. And guess which direction he sprinted towards when he got into power? He was the pro-cop, pro-corruption guy. I mean, he has done extremely little in this city by ways of governance. That's where his connection to Trump also, you can see those parallels. He doesn't care about governing at all. What he cares about are doing press conferences, doing swanky events, going out and demonstrating what trash cans can be used. He loves a press conference, fighting rats in the city. I'm sorry, dude. The rats won. The rats won in this instance. But just to wrap up this story here so people remember how weird this guy was, this is my favorite clip of Eric Adams. This is him giving instructions to parents about what they can do if they think their kid may be using drugs or in a gang.
What I would like to show here is to empower parents on how to search a room inside their home. It's imperative that you should know what's inside your household. And no one can state that you can't search a room in your own home. You write the Constitution. There are no First Amendment rights inside your household. It is your obligation and responsibility not only to protect the child that may be using an illegal drug or carrying an illegal gun, but you also have to protect the members of the household, their younger brothers and younger sisters, and the other.
Let's skip to when he's actually going through the.
Yeah, this is his tour of this definitely real child's bedroom and what you could find if you want.
And some COs are going to have to do this to Eric Adams' cell.
It's a recreation of, apparently the FBI was or the feds were searching his residence this morning, so he got a little taste of this morning.
Box of this nature, maybe a simple jewelry box, but if you look through it closely, you don't know what your child may be hiding. For instance, a gun could be hidden, a small caliber weapon could be hidden inside a jewelry box. Look at the various colognes and perfumes and photos and pictures. You should always, when your child brings in his popular knapsack with many different locations, look through it to see what exactly is your child carrying in addition to a book.
Okay, I think that's good.
No, not good.
Use crack pipe. Could have found it on the street.
Keep going.
It's quite possible. But this is a discussion piece where you should start speaking with him to find out what is he doing with it. And the whole
good parenting advice there.
This invokes conversation.
Find a crack pipe.
Look at picture frames and behind them, cameras. Try to determine what's taking place. Behind a picture frame, you can find bullets. What does that mean to find bullets?
Loose bullets.
Does it mean your child is carrying a gun? No. Where there's smoke, there's possible fire. Where there's a bullet, there's possibly a gun. You should engage in the conversation and find out what are they doing with the item, and this empowers the parents.
Okay.
Look at all the items.
Yeah. There's other parts where I think didn't realize we were doing the full thing, but he finds a gun in a pillow. He uses the word secrete inaccurately. Popular knapsack with many different locations. Just a weirdo.
I mean, the Olayemi exchange on Breakfast Club is pretty indicative of his whole thing, which is she's like, hey, you have been hysterically inflating the threat of crime in a way that's actually kind of affecting tourism. And he's like, actually, no, I haven't. But, crime is a huge problem and you people underplay it. And actually, that's the big problem is how you don't help join me in inflating crime.
Right.
It turns out he's a criminal. Interesting.
A little bit. Turns out that a lot of that's...
Allegedly.
Right. Thank you for the legal protections. A lot of this stuff is a projection. Little lesson for you. All right, folks. Quick break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by Jeff Schuhrke, a labor historian, author of the new book, Blue Collar Empire, The Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anticommunist Crusade. Be right back. we are back, and we are joined now by Jeff Schuhrke, labor historian, labor journalist, labor historian, assistant professor at the Harry Van Arsdale Jr. School of Labor Studies at SUNY Empire State University, author of the new book, Blue Collar Empire, The Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anti-Communist Crusade. Jeff, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Great to be back.
And congratulations on the book. We're so happy to have you on. It's funny because I was talking to Matt, our producer. I was like, is there a good book that you can recommend to me about that isn't entirely biased in this regard about labor and even the AFL-CIO in particular and its connection with Hoffa and some of the and organized crime in that regard? And he was like, oh, Jeff's coming out with a new book, and it's particularly about the CIA and the Cold War in this in this area. But it is really, I think, the first time I've read a history of the labor movement in this way that isn't just basically about corruption broadly and nails down how the labor movement or the AFL-CIO in particular had this connection with the government that resulted in this degradation over these years.
Yeah, it's it's not a very, unfortunately, not a very like inspiring or uplifting kind of history of labor history, but it is really important, I think. For many decades, and some could arguably say even still today, many of the top union officials and labor officials within the AFL-CIO and its affiliated unions were closely tied to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, to the State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, National Endowment for Democracy, and of course the CIA, which is where the sort of derisive moniker AFL-CIA comes from. That was kind of started in the late 60s when some of this came to light for the first time during the Vietnam War. A lot of these labor officials were especially kind of rabidly anti-communist because they had fought against communists and other leftists within their own union ranks for so many decades. And they were very eager to maintain a seat at the table with, and maintain sort of legitimacy and respectability in the eyes of the U.S. government, because they weren't particularly radicals in how they pursued unionism. They didn't like ideas of class consciousness or class struggle. It was more just about, having the right connections and having a more amicable relationship with bosses and managers at the bargaining table, and trying to be equals in economic planning and demonstrating that, like, look, we're loyal, patriotic citizens, and we hate the Soviet Union and communists as much as anyone else, or even more so. And and as you mentioned, it did kind of serve to lead to this kind of degradation in this decline in union density and union power, because as I argue, the AFL-CIO was so focused on waging this Cold War overseas and devoting so many resources and so much energy to this, while not organizing the unorganized in the U.S. and not fighting back against corporate America's attacks on the labor movement, and not being enthusiastic enough in sort of jumping on and supporting the various social movements that were happening throughout the 60s and 70s. I mean, there were some exceptions, but generally speaking, the mainstream labor officials from the AFL-CIO were not kind of doing the things that we would hope that they would do, and instead devoting so much time and energy and resources on trying to defeat any kind of left-wing or anti-capitalist or worker-led labor movement in pretty much everywhere around the world.
And right, it was really an assault on union internationalism. And I think that, I guess a good place to start might be the 1930s, right? When you see union density and that rise, and communism and communists being huge in that struggle, right? And their efforts in terms of labor organizing being central to building up that union density. Just take us through the Great Depression, the role that communists played here in the United States in labor organizing in particular.
Yeah, so obviously with the Depression, it was millions of people, working class people, lost their jobs, their homes, their life savings, and it was clear to a lot of people that capitalism just wasn't working, and so they were much more receptive to communism, and the Communist Party USA grew to unprecedented heights. Still marginal overall in U.S. politics, but much more influential than it had ever been, because it wasn't just about ideology. It was actually a very practical and well-organized party, and they were especially active in organizing the unorganized in the labor movement and trying to be more inclusive, because before then it was very typical for unions to try to, especially the AFL affiliated unions, to exclude racial minorities and women and immigrants and so-called unskilled workers. And so the CIO was created in 1935 to kind of take advantage of the fact that, just like now, millions of workers were so eager to unionize. Unions were very popular. There was a lot more class consciousness because of the reality of the Depression. And the AFL was not taking advantage of that to go out and put in the resources to organize millions of workers in the auto industry and steel industry and electrical industry and others. So the CIO kind of broke away from the AFL and went about organizing these millions of previously unorganized workers and successfully unionizing the biggest corporations in the country at the time, which is sort of like the equivalent of if Amazon and Walmart and McDonald's were like unionized totally and wall to wall in a few years. Like, that's basically what was happening. And the CIO welcomed in, or at least tolerated, communist union organizers because they were such dedicated and effective organizers, whereas the AFL, having always been more conservative, had totally kind of shunned communists and other radicals. But the CIO welcomed them in the 30s and 40s. So then coming out of, after the end of World War II in 1945 and kind of the beginning of the Cold War, the rivalry between the US and Soviet Union, a lot of unions within the CIO were led by communists, or at least, communist fellow travelers and allies. And they were not eager to have this Cold War standoff. They thought this would only serve to benefit corporate America by being able to divide the working class and focus more on, militarism and war and imperialism. And the CIO leader, non-communist leaders, kind of made a political calculation. And obviously this is the period of McCarthyism and the Red Scare and the Taft-Hartley Act being passed, this broad anti-union law. So the CIO's non-communist leaders made this calculation that they would be better off just purging all the communists and expelling 11 communist-led unions from the CIO. And I think it was a really dramatic and unfortunate turning point for the labor movement, where things started to kind of go into decline. The CIO became a shell of its former self. It lost like a quarter of its membership through these purges, and then just kind of limped along for a few more years and joined the AFL to become the AFL-CIO. And it was really kind of just crystallized with the CIO from the beginning that they were politically against any kind of leftism. It was kind of born out of the Cold War. And to some extent, that's still a problem. Like, another important book that recently came out is Hamilton Nolan's book, The Hammer, where he criticizes the contemporary AFL-CIO for not doing enough to put forward the resources and energy to help organize the millions of workers who are really ready to go. They're trying to organize on their own in many cases, and they just need some institutional backing. And it's not happening. And so I think that's tied to this history that I'm talking about in this book.
And the post-war period, that is right when Taft-Hartley also gets passed as well. So speak about that effort to, after World War II, discipline labor and how that coincides with this change in the AFL-CIO as well.
Yeah, because the labor movement throughout the late 30s and 40s had grown to unprecedented heights. So by the end of World War II, roughly 35% union density in the private sector. Like 1 in 3 non-agricultural workers in the U.S. was unionized. It's incredible.
Now we're in the single digits, right?
in the private sector, yeah, it's like a little less than 7%. So really an incredible moment. And yeah, the corporate America and the Republicans, business elites, and this was after years of the New Deal, as well as a lot of economic controls put in place during World War II. And so the business elites were like really eager to clamp down on the power of labor, especially after late 45 and 1946, the biggest strike wave in U.S. history, 5 million workers on strike to make sure that they could maintain good wages amid inflation after the war. And partly there was kind of this backlash to all these strikes. In 1946, the midterm elections that year, the Republicans took control of Congress for the first time since before the New Deal had started. And this Congress members included people like Joseph McCarthy and Richard Nixon and others like ardent anti-communists who were eager to make a name for themselves. And they directly tied opposition to the Soviet Union to opposition to the labor movement here at home, and passed the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 over President Truman's veto. And the Taft-Hartley Act included all kinds of anti-union provisions saying unions cannot engage in the kind of militant strike actions that, like the sit-down strike, that had helped lead to all this union growth, and a lot of other things. But in particular, it included a requirement that union officers had to sign a affidavit swearing that they were not and had never been members of the Communist Party. And interestingly, it didn't say you have to sign an affidavit saying you were never a member of any kind of fascist party or Nazi party. Right. It was just Communist Party. And some of the, CIO leaders and unionists, either because they were communists or because they were just sympathetic or just didn't agree with this, they refused to go along and sign these affidavits. And that was part of the pretext for why they got kicked out of the CIO.
How did these anti-communist lawmakers build consensus to such a degree that they were able to get a bunch of Democrats on board? I know there were a lot of anti-communist war hawk Democrats. What was that guy's name that Biden says is his...
Scoop Jackson.
Scoop Jackson, yeah, his mentor on this particular front, or his ideological North Star as it relates to Israel. Anyway, Scoop Jackson was one of them. Like, how did that happen? How did this anti-communist consensus build to the point where they were able to override Truman's veto on this?
A lot of it was the fact that there, like we were talking about, in the 30s, the Communist Party USA was, somewhat influential, and it did grow, and there were actual communists in the labor movement and in the U.S. government and the State Department and different agencies, and and there had been this World War II alliance between the U.S. and Soviet Union, and there was a sense from a lot of even Democrats, but Republicans especially, that that this sort of paranoia and hysteria was that there was truth to it, and that the country really was in some kind of peril. And of course, the military-industrial complex was starting to be built up around this time, and there was it was sort of the military mobilization and the need for wartime production that had pulled the economy out of the Depression during the war, and a lot of obviously, of course, a lot of military contractors, but also politicians, members of Congress, wanting to make sure that there were jobs in their districts. Got behind this idea of the military-industrial complex, and we needed to have a more and more military buildup, new innovations. Now there was an arms race with the Soviet Union, and all these justifications given for ever more military buildup and never-ending war, essentially, got tied to economic policy and political considerations for getting elected. So I think it was a lot of factors. Someone like Scoop Jackson was especially prominent more in the 70s. And part of it, his thing was just really ideologically anti-communist, which is true for a lot of the labor leaders of this whole Cold War period, kind of true believers that, that they were really focused so much more on this idea of so-called democracy. And I think it's they use democracy and freedom as just kind of these euphemisms. I don't think it was because you often see them backing like right-wing dictatorship.
We do that to this day. We do that to this day.
Right. But a lot of the labor leaders were so much more focused on this battle of democracy versus totalitarianism, and not so much interested in the battle between workers and bosses, like, which is really what the labor movement should be focused on, I think. It was much more like there were all these, you mentioned labor internationalism at a lot of international labor conferences, and the creation of different international labor bodies that the AFL-CIO was supporting. They made sure that all the discussions were about, like, how do we fight the communists? How do we isolate the Soviet Union? How do we undermine left-wing forces? Because it wasn't just about actual communists. It was just anything that was slightly to the left of center was just branded communist and beyond the pale, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, everywhere. And so at these like international conventions, so much of the discussion and focus was on like these Cold War questions of geopolitics, and not so much about how do we empower workers, how do we curb the power of corporations, and things that you would think labor movements should be focused on.
So it's an era of labor liberalism in a sense, and you talk about how the AFL-CIO became increasingly invested in the Cold War aims of the government as the 50s and 60s roll on. Just take us through that period of change and how, at the end of the day, the AFL-CIO got subsidized, right, by the government in order to push them in that direction.
Yeah, the AFL, it's before it merged with the CIO, the AFL's leaders were really true believers in the anti-communist cause. And even before World War II was over, when the Soviet Union was still our ally, the AFL was already it was creating this new international arm called the Free Trade Union Committee, which was going to go. It sent representatives to Western Europe, to places like France and Italy, where communist parties were pretty popular, to try to divide the working classes of those countries, to say, create rival, separate anti-communist splinter unions that were going to be pro-US. And so the AFL was kind of doing this on its own before the US government even really got in on the Cold War itself. While the CIO was a little different, like I said, and they were kind of pushed into, because of McCarthyism and Taft-Hartley, the CIO kind of more gradually and a little bit more reluctantly got into the Cold War. And then the two merged in 1955. But a lot of these union officials had been fighting communists in their own ranks for many decades. And they saw themselves as the real experts in how you fight communists. Even they thought they knew better than even the CIA in how you do it. And, with communists and other left-wing anti-capitalist movements around the world, their base of support often is the working class and unions. And so unions were seen by the government, by the US government, as like a crucial battleground in the Cold War. Like, if we want to win, if we want to isolate the communists and other leftists, we need to make sure that the labor movements of various countries from Europe to Latin America to Asia and Africa have to remain firmly in the US camp. And they saw how the AFL and the AFL-CIO had already been doing some of that on its own, and thought, well, these guys know they can open doors we can't. Like a lot of these CIO officials were like Ivy League educated WASPs who didn't know anything about the working class or how to talk to workers, but they knew people from the AFL-CIO who were actually, came out of the working class, and they could open doors. They could talk to union officials in places like Mexico or Argentina or France or Italy or Indonesia. They were kind of going everywhere, which is the book kind of covers multiple continents over multiple decades. But eventually the AFL-CIO and the foreign policy establishment, the State Department, CIA, USAID, they all became kind of closely enmeshed. And yeah, the AFL-CIO received lots of money, millions of dollars from the US government to carry out various programs, like ostensibly a lot of educational training programs for workers overseas that were, about collective bargaining and union administration, but also like how to keep leftists out of your union ranks, how to respond when someone comes to the union meeting and starts speaking out against Yankee imperialism or whatever, how to shut them down and shut them up. and also funneling a lot of money into like small scale community development projects in parts of Latin America and Africa, of like to say like if you were a member of one of these anti-communist pro-US unions in another country, you could actually materially benefit with like a new health clinic in your community, or affordable worker housing that you could have access to if you were, loyally in the U.S. camp in the Cold War. So the AFL-CIO, there was a lot of this was the money and resources was coming from the U.S. government, but the AFL-CIO was, funneling it and working it as the face of it to labor movements abroad.
Is that how some members of the mafia get involved here? Just in the sense of like, the CIA had relationships with some members of the mafia as it related to like, I don't know, attempts on Castro's life. And because of their issues with him shutting down the casinos in Cuba, like these connections go back. And to me, it just like, I was thinking back to growing up, what you hear about unions. There are a lot of people that would just say, oh, corrupt, the mafia's involved, etc. Like, how much of that was a big part of this dynamic that you're describing of reorienting the labor unions under this Cold War incentive structure?
So I don't get into that too much in the book, really. It's a great question, and there's a book, I forget the author's name, I think it's called Murder in the Garment District, that came out a couple years ago that does touch a lot on like the International Ladies Garment Workers in New York, and they were kind of infiltrated by the mafia. But there are different, there are some examples that come to mind. I mean, for one thing, the CIA was working with the AFL-CIO and these unions in France, anti-communist unionists in France, and the French dock workers in the Mediterranean, to try to, because some of the more leftist dock workers wanted to, in the 1950s and 60s, obstruct weapons that the French were sending to Indochina during the Vietnamese fight for independence. And so some of the leftist dock workers wanted to stop sending arms. They wanted to obstruct the shipment of arms. And then the CIA, working with the AFL and anti-communist groups, hired like gangsters and mafia people from like Corsica and other places to come in and like rough up these dock workers and throw them into the port to make sure that the flow of weapons would continue going to Vietnam. And then from this connection, or from this came the French connection, this heroin trafficking networks that the CIA and AFL had kind of been connected to early on, of like heroin grown in Asia being moved through French ports and then into the United States. And another example that comes to mind has to do with the creation of the State of Israel and the Zionist militias in Palestine, like the Haganah, and how they were, effectively waging a war of ethnic cleansing against the indigenous Palestinian people. But there was an arms embargo over Palestine in 1948 that the U.S. and UK had imposed to try to limit the bloodshed. And in the U.S., people like Meyer Lansky, the notorious mafia leader, mobster, who effectively controlled the East Coast ports, he was a big supporter of Zionism and wanted to, and so was like Jimmy Hoffa and some of these people in the Teamsters, and they worked to smuggle weapons out of the U.S., and out of the New York and New Jersey ports to Palestine to arm Zionist militias. So there's some of that as well. But like I say, that's not something, I don't know quite as much about that history. It's not something so much in this book, but it's definitely, I think it is connected, and there's some other good stuff out there that people should read.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, it's hard to disentangle what's an attempt to discredit labor and what's actually legitimate. And so that's why I wanted to kind of pick your brain in that regard. So just some lessons that you want in the midst of kind of this labor renaissance, or a more favorable environment for organizing, at least currently under this administration. What would you say to unions, maybe as it relates to like taking funds from the State Department, or what this history says about how the labor movement can learn going forward?
Yeah, I think ultimately, to put it simply, I think unions should not be taking money from the State Department, which unfortunately they still do. The AFL-CIO does even now. But I think like this is a moment where many workers are very eager to unionize, and the establishment of the labor movement should really put its power and resources into supporting that. In this history that I've written about, so often, like a huge amount of the AFL-CIO's budget, up to a quarter of the budget in the 60s, was going towards these foreign policy issues, and they were taking millions of dollars from the U.S. government to carry out these Cold War interventions overseas that ultimately only harmed workers both at home and abroad, because it made it easier for multinationals to offshore and to outsource and send production overseas to wherever they could pay workers the lowest, because a lot of the unions in some of these different countries in Central America and the Caribbean and Asia, the labor movements there had been divided and weakened in part because of the AFL-CIO's interventions over so many years. And a lot of the more progressive pro-worker governments around the world, even democratically elected governments, were overthrown in these coups, places like Chile or Brazil and other places that the AFL-CIO had supported, which I write about in the book. And ultimately, it made it so much easier for corporations to be able to divide and conquer. And so many of the resources the AFL-CIO had in the mid-20th century, when it really was powerful, when there really was 35% union density, and the biggest corporations in the economy were fully unionized, instead of using that power to continue organizing the unorganized and bringing racial minorities and women into the labor movement, and hindering militarism and war and building up a more robust social welfare state. Instead of doing all that, the AFL-CIO was focused on like how do we defeat the left in all these different countries around the world. And I think that internationalism is vital and necessary for the labor movement. So I'm not saying the AFL-CIO and unions should not be involved overseas, but it should be more in the spirit of genuine solidarity. And that means often having to be in conflict with U.S. foreign policy and some of the things the U.S. government is doing overseas, especially obviously in Gaza, right? It's been really important to see so many unions come out, not only calling for a ceasefire, but also more recently, 7 major unions representing about half of all union members in the country have been calling on Biden for an arms embargo on Israel. And it's become even more clear why that's necessary just this past week with the war now spreading into Lebanon. Joe Biden has been good on many union issues, the National Labor Relations Board and other agencies, and just in his rhetoric as well, with the exception of the potential railroad strike a couple of years ago that he shut down. But it's been, interesting, not surprising really, but to see that, the unions are saying to him, on matters of war and peace that are really urgent and important, and how working class people's taxpayer money is being funded. They're saying, stop sending arms to Israel. And he's just ignoring them completely and only approving more billions of dollars in weapons. So I think that's going to sort of, this wasn't your question really, but it's going to kind of tarnish his legacy as, the so-called most pro-union president ever, when the unions are begging him to take a better stance on the most critical foreign policy issue today, and he's just ignoring them.
Exactly right, Jeff. So we're going to be talking in just a second a little bit more about what's going on in Lebanon, but really appreciate your time today. Jeff Schuhrke, labor historian, journalist, author of Blue Collar Empire, The Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anti-Communist Crusade. We'll put a link to that beautiful book wherever people are listening to or watching this in the description. Thanks so much, Jeff. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. We will be right back in just a second with Séamus to talk about Lebanon. are back, and we are joined now by Seamus Malekafzali, journalist writing about the Middle East in publications like The Nation and The Baffler, and also Seamus has a Substack, which we will link to. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
So you have escaped Lebanon, I should say, or left Lebanon in this just extremely scary time. I'm glad to see that you're doing all right. But Israel has been bombarding Lebanon with strikes over the past week, continuing to escalate. Hundreds have been killed, including dozens of women and children. And the strikes are now, I think there was a strike in Beirut maybe this morning, if I'm reading that correctly, or at the very least outside the Beirut suburbs. Just take us through the past few weeks and what's been happening in Lebanon and the terror that Israel has inflicted upon the population, starting with those pager and walkie-talkie attacks.
Yeah, I mean, the current round of escalation had started with those pager attacks. After the retaliation for the assassination of Fuad Shukr, the Hezbollah commander, had gone over in a way that I think was less than what some people were expecting. There was a slight lull in tensions in the country. But once those pager attacks happened, once there were literally thousands of pagers that were exploding, supposedly all belonging to Hezbollah members, but obviously that turned out not to be the case. That and then the walkie-talkie explosions that happened afterward, that shifted the ground under everyone's feet. From there, I could really tell that this was not going to be like other rounds of escalation in the past, and that turned out to be correct. Strikes inside South Beirut, which were previously so infrequent that there were several months between them, now they happen literally every single day. The bombardments that occurred in South Lebanon over this past week killed, I believe, half the people that died during the 2006 Lebanon war, in terms of numbers. Some of the most violent bombardments in the history of modern warfare in space of one day. And there really is no sign of that abating or moving into some sort of lower grade of warfare, anything close to a solution.
And this is the deadliest attack by Israel on Lebanon since 2006, but we also have the 1982 invasion of Beirut that we can talk about in terms of like what people in Lebanon have experienced as it relates to Israel aggression over the past decades. Can you talk about that cultural memory and that history of Israel's incursions into Lebanon and how that informs the current aggression and people's reaction to it?
I mean, a lot of people in Lebanon, I mean, there are lots of sectors that have expressed extremely racist feelings towards the Palestinians for the actions of the PLO. There are people who hate Hezbollah for a whole variety of different reasons. And then similarly, people who hate the Lebanese forces and all these different things. But generally speaking, despite all of these varieties of hatreds and grievances, nobody is going to be caught dead openly caping for Israel, regardless of anything. Israel and its invasions and the destruction that it caused is the one thing that, generally speaking, even if they have covert relationships with Israel and they do things for Israel, publicly speaking on their behalf is something that is very rarely done inside Lebanon. And all of these wars that have been caused by Israel or have been accelerated by Israel, they've created a system of living in Lebanon that leads it to have built up certain resiliences that other countries might not have. When I do other interviews about this, I think a lot of people are surprised when I talk about the fact that up until very, very recently, Lebanon had been mostly proceeding as normal, and the capital had sort of siloed itself off from the rest of the country and what's been happening down there. People have learned when to panic They know when to panic. And now we have reached that point where people have started to panic. They know what is about to come. And that is the thing that has struck so much terror into the rest of the country.
Let's pull up a map of Lebanon here just so people can get a geographic sense of what we're talking about. If we could just zoom in closer to the top of the Israel border so we can see. Thanks, guys. So Beirut, you can see there, is far from the Israel border. You can see Golan Heights, which is the southwestern corner of Syria, but obviously Trump infamously recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli territory illegally. But that incursion and that recognition, Golan is right there on the border of Lebanon. So a lot of this fighting happens at the southern border of Lebanon and the northern border of Israel. That has been the pretext for what Netanyahu has asserted. He's speaking at the UN today, that essentially this military operation is so that the Israelis in the north can return to their homes. But you see Beirut, right? You can see that Beirut is quite far from that southern border of Lebanon and northern border of Israel, and yet the pager attacks, the walkie-talkie bombing happened all over the country, set off at the exact same time, which again, if a Muslim majority country's military or militant group within the country set off coordinated bombs in that manner throughout a sovereign nation's borders, it would be called a terrorist attack. Not the same in this instance. But, you know, bombing Beirut and bombing the suburbs of Beirut has nothing to do with Israelis returning to their homes in the north, as you can just see geographically. These actions plus the bombing of these pagers and walkie-talkies, you can only interpret that as a way to sow terror within the population, in my view.
Exactly. I mean, most of this stems back, and I've written about this before, it stems back from the Dahya doctrine, which was something that Israel had been doing in other conflicts, but was really cemented in the 2006 war. The idea being that the way for Hezbollah to be deterred from further actions was to punish the civilian population, its base of support inside South Beirut, which is Dahya. So all of these villages, all of these cities, all these municipalities, they were to be targets regardless of whatever military infrastructure actually existed there, if at all. So in 2006, southern Beirut was bombed extraordinarily heavily. Neighborhoods were leveled, despite most of the fighting being in southern Lebanon, just as it is right now. And a similar thing was implemented in Gaza on a much larger, much more expansive scale, with the entire territory essentially being deemed as one gigantic military base. The idea here is that, yes, if South Beirut is turned into a military zone, that Hezbollah and its support base among the population, among the majority Shia population in these areas, will be cut. They'll be, resentful of their presence, and they will eventually, I don't know what the next step would be. They buckle. And they'd happily accept whatever political system or political solution Israel would want to give them. The issue is that did not happen in 2006. That has not happened now. And even though the population of Lebanon, broadly speaking, is not in favor of a war, they never have been, that does not entail an automatic acceptance of every single thing that Israel has ever wanted to do, not by a long shot.
Well, it's U.S. imperial mentality, right? Which is essentially breaking the backs of people based with bloodshed and militaristic might in order for them to accept the desired outcome of the people doing the bombing. And as you're saying, this has not worked. This has not worked. As evidenced by these multiple instances of resistance over these years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different military calculus than that Israel would be, because Israel, as the actor doing these offensive operations, they can be deterred by cost, while groups which are fighting Israel can, there's costs that have to be considered, its whole impetus is resistance, of preserving the society in which people live, their way of life, of resisting the, like you're saying, the imperialism of other powers. To say that just because things have become difficult, that they're automatically going to buckle. I mean, what instance in the past, in the modern past, with America, with Israel, has that worked on? In Palestine, over the past 76 years of constant occupation and military resistance, at what point does this start? And I think there is a recognition within the Israeli state that they're never going to, that's not going to happen, which is why you have a lot of right-wing settlers, people who have Netanyahu's ear in this current government, not necessarily talking about just dismantling Hezbollah, which if you haven't dismantled Hamas, how are you going to deal with Hezbollah? But that's a different thing.
Yeah.
But they're talking about settlement. They're talking about settlement in southern Lebanon. They're talking about depopulation. That was something that the Diaspora Affairs Minister mentioned only a few days ago. They're talking about removing what they call explicitly an enemy population in southern Lebanon, of removing it, of making sure that the support base, if they can't be disconnected from Hezbollah, they need to be physically removed so that the problem is no longer there. That's what they're applying in Gaza, in the West Bank, and that's what they're going to apply in Lebanon as well.
And Netanyahu is using the same language that he used as it relates to Gaza when he's talking about their military operations in southern Lebanon. Please leave your homes, he writes in English, and you'll be able to return, people of Lebanon, which is just like essentially a written like press release for the West to give justification for when they slaughter people in southern Lebanon, that, hey, we told them, we dropped leaflets, we told them to leave their homes, and they didn't, and so what do you know? And the expansion northward is very concerning. Can you speak a little bit more about Hezbollah's role in this? And I guess, all we hear in this country is that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization and it's Iranian proxy, right? I think we did another interview or I guess it was last week with the guys from Blowback, where this is kind of Cold War era language of like, oh, it's, they're Soviet proxies. So that justifies essentially them, our military operations against them. But yes, like Hezbollah is a resistance group largely, but it also is a civil organization, or it's a political party in Lebanon. It's responsible for certain civilian infrastructure and things like that. Like, if you could just clarify for people what Hezbollah actually is and its role in Lebanon and society there.
Well, Hezbollah, I mean, I don't think anyone who is in Hezbollah is going to deny the inspiration that the party took from the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic leadership that emerged from there. But Hezbollah started because of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in the 80s. It did not exist before. You oftentimes hear about the fact that, like, Hezbollah, you get the implication that Hezbollah existed beforehand and that's why Israel had to invade, but that was absolutely not the case. One came before the other. And from there, it was able to expand. It was able to achieve the first and only time in history in which an Israeli withdrawal was predicated on no peace deal or negotiated settlement, but they just up and left in southern Lebanon. That gave them huge credence and support with the Lebanese public. But yes, they're a political party. They are a massive civil organization. They interact with institutions in Lebanon at so many different levels. I want to say in the last election they got the most votes out of any other party in the Lebanese elections. The idea that they're an Iranian proxy, I mean, it's false, obviously false, but I think the best evidence of that is the fact that Hezbollah is so integrated within the Lebanese state and the Lebanese society that it is not going to rise and fall on whatever Iran says. It has its own strategic calculuses to make. If Iran were to say tomorrow, Hezbollah, you have to just drop the whole thing against Israel, that is absolutely not something that they are doing. are not just thinking about what Iran has to do or what, for example, Yemen has to do, but they have to think about what will the effect of further conflict have on the Lebanese populace itself. That's what informs a lot of the decision making. This is a Lebanese party. This is a Lebanese organization that formed from Lebanese roots. It has inspiration in Iranian politics, but it is not the be all and end all of the situation.
And can you speak a little bit more about how Hezbollah was able to take on such a prominent role within Lebanon, the power vacuum, and why resistance against the Israeli settler state is such a galvanizing force for people within Lebanon, where Hezbollah has had this staying power since the Civil War, as you discuss?
Well, I mean, after the Civil War, most militias were forced to disband. They were forced to give up their military arms, but Hezbollah was not, because of the situation in southern Lebanon with the Israeli occupation, which they were fighting. Once they were able to achieve that, the purpose of their fighting, their continued military presence, was both completed but also assured for the future. They were able to prove the purpose that they had, the deterrent capacity that they had, the necessity for their defense. Because by now, especially by now, they are more powerful than the Lebanese state that they essentially protect. They are more powerful and more cohesive than any other institution in Lebanon, civil institution in Lebanon. So while there are many different parties in Lebanon or sectors of the populace in Lebanon that may oppose them, they ultimately are able to act independent of that. But as well, I mean, something that I've had to explain to a lot of people who've tried to talk to me about this is, okay, people don't want war in Lebanon. That's been established by poll after poll after poll. But being against a war coming to Lebanese shores is different from being necessarily anti-Hezbollah. And being anti-Hezbollah is, not automatically, being pro-Israel or something like that. There are a lot of people who are very critical of Hezbollah who, in the face of the gigantic Israeli threat that faces this country, are willing to put aside many other considerations that they would have to make in order to give that support to Hezbollah, to acknowledge, the kind of sacrifices that they have made through this. Speaking personally in the scenes that I would run in, there are a lot of people that I know who were, gay, trans, socialist, thoroughly critical of Hezbollah, for example, being anti-gay, for instance. But when it comes to this issue, how existential it is, they are willing to put certain things aside to support what they see as an important venture.
Well, yes, and there's something to me so cynical about people in the West picking apart these resistance groups and organizations for their lack of liberal attitudes, when the environment that the United States' imperialism has created in this region is fundamentally anti-liberal. So it's like, what do you expect? What do you expect?
No, this is a larger discussion, but there's a whole thing with the fact that Israel's wars and American imperialism have created environments in which left-wing groups that had a tremendous amount of influence in the 50s and the 60s were destroyed. They had their leaderships, assassinated. And in the wake of that, you had groups like Hamas, you had groups like Hezbollah, who were able to synthesize nationalism and Islamism, and that proved to be a very effective engine for a lot of people and to galvanize support behind them. With almost not just Lebanon, not just Palestine, so many different countries, they destroy groups that do not have necessarily religious connotations with them. And then the groups that inevitably emerge out of that power vacuum are going to be people who absolutely are not aligned with you, aligned civilizationally with you as an American, as an American politician. But that's, yeah, exactly. You've created a situation, and then you want to be like, oh, well, we wish it was different. We wish there are certain things that, were easier for us to swallow. But like, this is what it is. This is how it is now, and you have to deal with it.
And can you talk about the evacuations that people have had to undergo? I've seen reports up to 500,000 people in Lebanon have had to leave their homes, and that shelters are completely overrun at this point.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing about the evacuation orders that the IDF has been issuing throughout Gaza and now in southern Lebanon. When it was happening in Gaza, the IDF's Arabic spokesman would do things like he would post on Twitter in Arabic that there was only a certain road you have to go through that's safe, and it's only open for the next however many minutes, essentially, acting like this has been up forever, but only you have this much time to get there. And in Rafah, there would be evacuation orders, and then the airstrikes would begin immediately. And it's been the exact same thing in southern Lebanon. The strategy has not changed because it's a strategy that they're absolutely okay with. They issue the evacuation order, and within only a few minutes, they start bombing. In the Bekaa Valley, in the northeast, there was a warning issued that in the next 2 hours, if you are near a Hezbollah site, whatever that means, if you have to get 1 kilometer away, we're going to start a huge bombing run in 2 hours. They start bombing within 15 minutes, essentially. This is a huge swathe of the country that is now basically said you have to get out now. They're all going down the same road system. And similarly in Lebanon, you have these bombs going off all around you. A trip that is now maybe an hour or 2 hours has now become 13. And when you get to Beirut, a place that may be safe, you don't know that for sure, you are now facing a situation in which there are not enough shelters, that you have to sleep on the streets. There is no central government that is able to really help you in any significant way. And you have no way out of the situation. You either have to stay in Beirut, or you have to hope that Syria might be safer for you if you want to cross the border there. There are literally no good options here. There are no positive options or safe options here for many, many, many Lebanese. And that is exactly how Israel would like it to be.
Well, they would like it too, because this is, again, if we could just put this map up of the region, I think it helps, at least for me, it helps me visually. If you can go to Gaza there, just to show the Gaza Strip, they want all of this stuff on the Mediterranean. They want the coastal areas, right? This is just pure, pushing the Palestinians into the West Bank, pushing them into the desert of Jordan is what they've always said that they wanted, essentially. And Jordan, and then Lebanon, if you're expanding northward in that area, that's what that aim is too, is to continue to build up settlements and expand Israeli territory along the Mediterranean Sea, which is why the protestations about from the river to the sea from the Israeli state were just so ridiculous, and from Zionists, is because Israel has made has had tangible results in their efforts to conquer from the river to the sea. And it seems that is continuous. That continues to be their imperialist aim in this area in southern Lebanon, and now the entire population in Lebanon faces that terror. Right?
See, this is the thing that people should understand about this. Whenever the argument eventually comes up, where people rightfully talk about the want for settlement, not just in Gaza but further in the West Bank and also in Lebanon, critics will eventually say, well, no, they're talking about security. They don't want Hamas on their border. They want Hezbollah on their border. These are legitimate things that Israel needs to consider. The thing is that in literally every single scenario in which settlement was preceded by initial invasion, it was about security. That was the justification that was presented to the Israeli public. So the Sinai Peninsula, West Bank, Gaza, also southern Lebanon back in the 80s and through the 2000s, though there was no settlement that was able to occur there. These invasions happened on the basis of security, and then in almost all these scenarios, settlement occurred later on.
Yep.
We're talking hundreds of thousands of people who were expelled. I mean, in the Sinai Peninsula as well, people forget this. There was an active attempt to expel Bedouins from the Sinai Peninsula in occupied Egypt, and they were building settlements with tens of thousands of Israelis on them. There is no like the idea that southern Lebanon being settled, the idea that they want this, it is not implausible. This is something that far-right settlers want to happen. Just a few months ago, there were settlers who were flying, drones, I want to say, into southern Lebanon, dropping flyers saying that this land belongs to us. This is what they want. So we have to, this is frustrating to me, but I know that this is the case, that we have to continue operating under the guise that we don't know what the game is.
Right.
Like, we understand what the intentions are because it's being announced every single day on Israeli television, in Israeli newspapers, by Israeli government ministers, not people who are on the fringe. But for the past 11 months, and now for these next months, we're going to have to operate on this plane in which we're supposed to pretend that we don't know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, Séamus, I really appreciate your time today. I'm glad you're safe, by the way, and we're able to get out. I know that I'm sorry you have many friends. I'm sure you're thinking about in Lebanon. So I'm thinking of you, and thank you for taking the time to come on the show today to talk about it.
Thank you, Emma.
Really appreciate it. On a lighter note, I will say, Séamus dropped off, but Séamus looks so much like Chris Kreider, by the way. Like, I don't know, people care about that.
Who is
but
that?
He is one of the best players on the New York Rangers. Chris Kreider. It really I was waiting for Bradley to say something as a fellow hockey fan, but Chris Kreider, a man of also refined tastes and knows like 6 languages. So anyway, this is my fixation, not everybody else's. So with that, we're going to wrap up the first hour of this program, the free part of this program, head into the fun half where we will take your calls and read your IMs. But first, Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Yeah, we had Derek Davison on to talk about this same subject the other day, so on Tuesday. So check that out, patreon.com/Left Reckoning, talking with Anna Kornblue and Russell Spiglia about Frederick Jameson for patrons, patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
And we have Brandon soon. We will bring Brandon. Oh, hello.
Oh, there I am.
There you are. What's up, Brandon? What's happening on the discourse?
Yes, we should have a new episode out for all of our fans early next week. I don't know when yet. Like I said, I've been a bit busy the past 2 weeks. I know I'm very bad. Mea culpa, mea culpa. I prostrate myself at the feet of my fans. But you can follow me on X, the Everything app, at Pretty Bad Lefty, so you'll know when it comes out and any other things that we're doing.
Very cool. And on not on Left Reckoning, on ESPN today, Bradley and I are giving our picks against the spread. He has caught up to me in record time by going 3-0 last week. So we're heating up over there. YouTube.com/ESPN show. Do we have Binder?
From the void.
Coming from the void. Hello, Matt Binder.
Oh, I forgot to. Whoops. Hold on 1 second. Now I'm
like
at the
magic.
Majority Report.
There you are. Teleported into studio.
Yep, I'm there live. Right. Yep.
What's happening on your shows?
Yeah. So funny thing. Last night I wasn't feeling too good, so I was gonna not do a stream. I actually fell asleep, and then like the live stream gods woke me up, and I just so happened to check my phone around like 10:30. And I saw that Eric Adams got indicted. So I was like, oh my God, I got to go do a stream right now. And so last night I did a stream about the indictment. We didn't have the details we have now, but check it out if you want to hear my reaction. And also got some great calls from people around the country who chimed in about Adams. And it was good to celebrate, I guess, alongside people in Chicago who are used to this sort of thing, and all other sort of people from around the country. So check it out, youtube.com/Mapinder.
Alex from Brooklyn writes in, let's not forget that Mayor Adams was implicated in that secret WhatsApp group chat with pro-Israel CEOs and millionaires during the Columbia protests.
That's one thing I actually forgot to mention is the Turkey stuff is the most fleshed out, but it does appear that other foreign influence, including Israel, is being investigated, which that's the one inclusion I'm interested in, frankly.
Yeah.
Like, sure, I could do Russia, do whatever. Israel is the country that is influencing American politics too much, in my opinion. I don't think there's any other close to that, and that's what I'm interested in. So I await more developments on that front.
That's a can of worms they don't want to open, because how many politicians are bought off by Israel if they actually investigate this?
99% of them.
Yeah, it's not great. It's not great.
There is a section in the indictment where one of Eric Adams's contacts in Turkey reached out to his office to request that he does not make any statements on Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day.
Wow.
And he does not end up making any statements about Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. So, a little bit of something similar, I guess, to what you guys are talking about now that we could find out later on in terms of his totally natural and organic views on Israel.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right, guys, we're going to head into the fun half. Reminder, Matt, about the fun half song, the majority song this time. We don't want to leave people hanging. We'll take your calls, open up the phone lines in a bit, but for now, we'll just head into the fun half. See you there.
Okay, Emma, please.
Well, I feel that my voice is sorely lacking on the majority report.
Wait, look, Sam is unpopular.
I do deserve a vacation at Disney World. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome Emma to the show.
It is Thursday.
I think you need to take over for Sam.
Yes, please.
No. I'm gonna pause you right there.
Wait, what?
You can't encourage Emma to live like this. And I'll tell you why. She was offered a tour, sushi, and poker with the boys. Tour, sushi, and poker with the boys. She was offered a tour, sushi, and poker with the boys.
What?
Tour, sushi, and poker.
Tim's upset.
Tour, sushi, and poker with the boys. She was offered a tour, sushi, and
that's what we call it in the biz.
Tour, sushi, and poker with the boys.
Right.
Tour, sushi, and poker.
We're gonna get demonetized.
I just think that what you did to Tim Pool was mean.
Free speech.
That's not what we're about here. Look at how sad he's become now. We shouldn't even talk about it because I think you're responsible.
I probably am in a certain way, but let's get to the meltdown here.
Tour, sushi, and poker with the boys.
Oh my God.
Tour,
wow.
Sushi. I'm sorry, I'm losing my fucking mind. She was offered a tour, sushi, and poker with the boys.
Logic.
Tour, sushi, and poker with the boys. Boy. Tour.
I think I'm like a little kid. I think I'm like a little kid. I think I'm like a kid.
Tour.
I think I'm like a little kid. I think I'm like a little kid.
I had this debate 7,000 times.
A little kid. I think I'm like a little kid. I think I'm like a kid.
Tour. I'm losing my fucking mind.
Some people just don't understand.
So I'm not trying to be a dick right now, but like I absolutely think the U.S. should be providing me with a wife and kids.
That's not what we're talking about here. Okay, all right.
It's not a fun job.
Tour? That's a real thing. That's real thing. Real thing. Willy Wonka tour? That's a real thing. That's real thing. Real thing. What's that offered a tour? That's a real thing. That's real thing. Real thing. That's a real thing. That's real thing. Real thing. That offered a tour?
Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Rogan has done it again.
That offered a tour? That's a real thing. That's poker with the boys.
I think he might be blowing it out of proportion.
Real thing. That's poker with the boys. That offered a tour? That's a real thing. That's poker.
Let's go, Joey.
Tour? Sushi and poker with the boys.
Take it easy, buddy.
Tour, sushi, and poker.
Things have really gotten out of hand.
Sushi and poker with the boys.
Delusional.
Tour,
Deluded.
sushi.
You don't have a clue as to what's going on. Live YouTube.
Sam has the weight of the world on his shoulders. Sam doesn't want to do this show anymore. It was so much easier when the majority report was just you. You were happy.
Let's change the subject.
Right.
Rangers and Knicks are doing great.
Now shut up. Don't want people saying reckless things on your program.
That's
No.
one of the most difficult parts about this show.
This is a pro-killing podcast.
I'm thinking maybe it's time we bury the hatchet.
Left is best. Violet tour.
Don't be foolish, and don't fucking tweet at me, and don't binge. The way Emma has cucked all of these people, love it.
That's where my heart is, so I wrote my honors thesis about it.
Oh,
Sorry,
she
finance.
wrote an honest thesis. I guess I should hand the main mic to you now.
You are to the right of me on foreign policy.
We already fund Israel, dude. Are you against that?
That's a tougher question I have an answer to.
Incredible theme song.
Hi, Bumbler.
Emma Vigeland, absolutely one of my favorite people. Actually, not just in the game, like, period.
We are back, folks. It is the fun half. And we'll just get right into it right now, because I love pop music. I'm just being real about it. I like it when it's done well. I came up during the Lady Gaga era. She was my favorite. And I appreciate the reemergence of artists like Chappell Roan. It's mainstream pop that also is challenging, that speaks about issues with the LGBTQ community, and she's kind of just like exploding all over the place, becoming really popular. I will say that she probably needs a publicist because she's doing way too many live streams having to explain herself and her political opinions, and also she needs a publicist to push back against these liberals who are saying that she isn't endorsing Kamala Harris because she supports Trump or something like that. Well, I'm going to read the exact quote and then we'll
take time in the spotlight to understand you don't need to acknowledge everything everyone says about you.
She needs a publicist.
People, right.
Yeah.
There are people worthy of response, which is the minority of people. And then there are people who are worthy of your complete, just pretend you don't even hear them or see them. They're not worthy of your time, which is unfortunately the majority of the people.
So she did an interview with Rolling Stone last week, and these were the quotes that set off this firestorm about her, where she explained why she didn't go to Pride at the White House for Joe Biden. She said, "I'm not going to go to the White House because I'm not going to be a monkey for Pride." She revealed that she declined the invite during her set at Governor's Ball in June, addresses the Statue of Liberty. She dedicated My Kink is Karma to Joe Biden's administration.
Just to note for the liberals, that's the same June where the ongoing genocide Joe Biden was lying on behalf of in Gaza was going on. So yeah, I wouldn't want to be there anyway. Sorry to jump in, but I've been to 2 weddings since this fucking shelling has gone on since October 7th, and I've not been able to think about I've not been able to separate that. I had a fun time dancing. It's like, what do you start talking about immediately once you stop? It's Gaza.
So she declined to go to the White House, and she said this publicly: "We want liberty, justice, and freedom for all. When you do that, that's when I'll come." She said, referring to the famous lines on the Statue of Liberty's pedestal: "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." She spoke out in support of trans rights, women's rights, and freedom for all oppressed people in occupied territories. Roan told Rolling Stone that when she first got the invite, she considered going, but not to perform. Instead, she wanted to read poetry in protest of the U.S. government's support of Israel's war in Gaza.
Amazing.
"I had picked out some poems from Palestinian women," Roan said. "I was trying to do this as tastefully as I could because all I wanted to do was yell. I had to find something that's tasteful and to the point and meaningful and not make it about me and how I feel." So that's pretty clear to me. But her statements about this have been misrepresented because she's not endorsing Kamala Harris. But she explains in this video here that an endorsement doesn't mean she's not voting for her. She says she's voting for Harris. She just doesn't want to endorse her for the reasons that honestly are reflective of a lot of young people in this country who, I was more enthusiastic about Harris than Biden, of course, because of Biden's ideological Zionism and commitment to this genocide. But if I were an artist, would I want to endorse her, given the fact that she hasn't made any policy commitments on this front as it relates to an arms embargo or anything like that? This is reflective of how so many young people feel, but here she is explaining.
This is basically our
her
position.
reasoning. This is our position, but she got slammed
and even
for
on Biden
it.
in 2020. Like, like voting, we don't change our attitude towards, like, I don't generally change my attitude about voting. It's like the better coalitions, just get them across. But like, as far as endorsing and using your voice and saying, this is me, this represents me, no, that's another fucking bar. And liberals who want people to just say, hey, dance at the Pride event and forget about Gaza. No, you're fucked, actually. That's not going to play.
I have encouraged people to use critical thinking skills, learn about what they're voting for, learn about who they're voting for, and ask questions. And it's being completely taken out of context, per usual. There is nuance to what I say in interviews. And I think it's important that people use critical thinking. I think it's important for me to question authority and question world leaders and question myself, question my algorithm, question if some person that tweeted something about someone else is even true. It's important to